Bonjour, welcome everyone. My name is Dilber Mann, as you know. I actually work for Relic Entertainment. It is a Sega studio. Prior to that, it was part of THQ Publishing. So I'm here to talk about metrics, and specifically metrics that matter. Now, for those of us in the game development industry, we've had to deal with the challenges of scalability. And one way to do that has been to outsource. And it's been used quite frequently to handle the scalability challenge. So I'm here to talk about how we can establish reliable metrics to help us make informed decisions about how we distribute and scale development. So just really quickly, I want to give you a bit of context as to where I'm coming from and where some of the ideas and assumptions are coming from for this presentation. And it really comes down to a few roles that I've had throughout the many years working in the industry. And the three roles essentially are a central publishing role, a on-site vendor management role, and a studio development role. So I started off with Activision, spent most of my time with THQ Publishing, transferred to, or relocated to THQ China to work on site with our partners, and then later moved to Relic Entertainment, which is now a Sega studio. And all of that within an external development capacity. So it really gives me, it's really given me a few different perspectives on how decisions are made for scaling development. So before I talk about the discussion points, I want to mention that a lot of the content, a lot of the fundamental topics that we're going to talk about today in terms of metrics, I introduced at the XDS Summit last month. And there is a significant difference, however, for today's presentation, because the previous presentation I did at XDS was centric to client outsourcing to an external partner. And so today, I am going to cover distributed trends. And basically what that means is organizations that use a distributed workforce structure. So I'll explain that in a little bit more detail, but there are certain trends that are occurring or that have been occurring over the many years, especially in my experience working in Asia, that have converted consolidated organizations with consolidated workforce that outsource into a more of a distributed structure. So I'm going to talk a little bit more in terms of details on those trends. And then we're going to talk a bit about establishing a foundation of metrics that we can use to make decisions about planning a distributed workforce. So when I talk about establishing foundation metrics, I'm going to talk a bit about cost savings analysis. And really cost savings analysis, a lot of people use that to make decisions about how they're going to outsource or how much are they going to distribute their development. And so I want to touch on this because it's a foundation metric, but we're going to go beyond cost savings analysis, and I'm going to talk a bit about what I like to call stakeholder metrics. And in this presentation, we're going to call them scalability metrics because they're metrics that speak to scalability. And it also comes from metrics that can be used as decision-making metrics based on the different stakeholders that you have in your company. So not everybody distributes development because of cost savings. There are other reasons for making those decisions. So we'll talk about that. And I have a few real-world examples of personal projects that I've worked on. So we're going to apply scalability metrics to those projects. And just to give you a bit of context of how you can use these scalability metrics. But I won't be getting into details about what work was done or specifically what project, but we'll get to see those percentages in terms of how the scalability metrics match against those projects. And then afterwards, I'll convert those over to actionable metrics that you can use to track your goals during production. Sound good? All right. So let's identify who in the audience or which groups in the audience this presentation will be targeting. So the first one is the organization with a consolidated workforce structure. Now, what this means is an organization that has all the resources under one roof, and then they'll use outsourcing to meet their needs of scalability whenever they need to. So I fall into that group. I work at Relic Entertainment. We do a lot of RTS games, Company Heroes 2, Warhammer 40K IP, for example. So Sega has a number of studios under their umbrella, and that doesn't make them a distributed workforce structure, but all the studios under there are consolidated workforce or resources that work on development and then outsource. So could you just let me know which one of you people, or how many of you fall under this category or group? Really? Okay, interesting. So that was only about 4 hands that came up there. So that's quite surprising to me because I wasn't expecting that. I thought there'd be more. Now the second distinct group under distributed development is what I like to call the organization with a distributed resource structure. So that's basically looking at an organization that has a primary location of resources, but has also established secondary and potentially tertiary locations where their team will span across multiple locations for every project that they work on. So it's part of their infrastructure to use a distributed workforce. So I'll explain this in a bit more detail as to why this is occurring, but just curious out of the audience here, how many of you fall under this group or are trying to achieve something similar or on your path to doing that? Oh, fantastic. No, this is really good. So there was a couple of hands that went up, and I'm quite excited to see that because my concern with this presentation today was that we potentially may not target those people. So that's great to see that. All right, so let's talk about distributed trends. So deciding between distributed or consolidated organization, the option exists for doing the distributed option. It's only available if you live in a region or your organization's in a region where there's a wide range of cost of living and a wide range in terms of salaries. So the choice for both is really driven by cost savings or scalability needs. So for the most part in our industry, we do outsource or we do distribute development because of scalability, essentially. And cost savings is also part of that as well. But for the option to distribute your workforce, it all depends on the region that you're living in. So I'll explain that in more detail as well. So I want to talk a bit about the relationship between the consolidated organization with the consolidated workforce and the one with a distributed workforce. So essentially on your left-hand side, you'll have a development studio, for example, that will outsource to an external partner. So this all seems familiar to everybody, correct? Yes, no? Yeah. So that's generally the gist of how we outsource. But what has been occurring for many years now, especially in my time in China working with vendors that have grown from 30 people to 100 to 200, we're starting to see this happen on a lot of projects. So you're still outsourcing to an external partner, but your external partner now has their teams distributed across multiple locations. It's not that they're outsourcing or insourcing to their other studios. It's just that part of their infrastructure is to balance their teams across other locations. And the reason why they do that is that they're looking to manage their burn rate across lower tier locations. So the reason for the secondary and tertiary locations is that the cost of living is much lower and the salaries are lower than their primary location. And as costs have been increasing, or mandate rates have been increasing for external partners year over year, we are seeing a balance of the mandate rate because of this trend. So when I was working for THQ and spent a lot of my time in Asia, working with vendors, one of my goals was to maintain the mandate rate, because there's, from 2007 to now, there's been a lot of changes in terms of exchange rate, especially the cost of living in Asia as well and globally. So we're trying to find a way to balance the rates so that we can still maintain the same level that we've had for several years. So I think I've only seen a rate change of about 10% in the last 5 to 7 years. And that's only because with the external partners that we worked with, we were able to develop a distributed workforce by balancing the teams between a primary location, their primary location, and their lower cost center, secondary, or tertiary location. And so the formula we use, we kind of fudged it a bit, essentially trying to make the decision. But eventually, we came up with a process, which is what I'm going to talk about today, which is scalability metrics. Right, so I wanted to just list out the different types of cities and cost of living that you can encounter in a distributed workforce structure. And this isn't any official list, but I just wanted to give you a bit more context of how this can look like. So essentially, what I'm saying here is that the first tier locations are very modern cities, where the industry is very modern as well and matured. And then as you go to lower cost tier cities, you'll start to see cities that are a bit less modern or in development, or where the industry is just emerging, our gaming industry. So the maturity level is a little bit less. The education is a little bit different as well. And if I take Asia as an example, and maybe some of you aren't familiar with Asia, but essentially if I look at China, Shanghai is a city on the water there, and an international hub for China, as an example. Very modern city, that would be considered a tier 1. And as you go further and further into China, into central China, you'll get into tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, lower cost center cities. And this also applies to Europe as well. There's a good range of cost of living as well in the region. And you can experience the same thing as you go further out. So again, the question is how did we plan distribution? And what we ended up doing is we developed a system of metrics to apply against the project to develop a decision-making metric that allowed us to expand our teams in a distributed workforce structure. So we're no longer having the secondary or tertiary locations as separate studios that worked with separate projects and separate clients with a lower cost center. We actually developed teams that worked across multiple locations all the time with infrastructure support from the primary location. So everything I just mentioned here right now, just want to briefly touch base on this with you, is that it doesn't just apply to an outsourced vendor or an external partner. Because a lot of external partners are developers as well. So this distributed workforce structure can apply to what we would call clients, what we call outsourcing partners, but essentially it can apply to both. So that's why I don't really call it here as an external partner or a developer client. I'm not trying to make that differentiation because the trend is applying to both now. Now, for a place like North America, it's a little bit more challenging as an option to do a distributed workforce structure, because in North America, the cost of living and salaries are relatively similar. There's not a huge difference in terms of the region. So it's very difficult for us to do that there. But in regions like South America, Europe, Asia, there's a bigger opportunity to do that. So that's the trend that I'm exposing today. So when I talk about the scalability metrics later on today in this presentation and these metrics, whether you're a consolidated workforce or just an organization with a distributed workforce structure, it applies to both. So just want to make that clear. So those that you put your hands up, for being one or the other group under distributed development, this will apply to both of you. And for those of you that didn't put your hand up, I think we'll talk about that later and find out who exactly or where you guys fit. Or maybe that'll come up in the questions. So first thing I want to talk about is cost savings analysis, because that has been the primary metric we use for making decisions about how much we want to outsource or how we plan a distributed workforce. So I want to ask the audience, do you guys know what cost savings analysis is, or have you been part of an analysis or have been exposed to that? Has anyone not heard of cost savings analysis? Okay. And has everyone actually put together a cost savings analysis report for their management? Has anyone been exposed to cost savings analysis? Yay, I got one person. All right, so let me just explain this really quickly. Essentially, cost savings analysis is a mandate rate comparison between a primary and a secondary location. In terms of outsourcing, we can look at it as an internal rate versus an external rate for the cost of a resource salary plus overhead. That's really what it is. And it takes into consideration how much scope of work that you want to outsource. And it also takes into consideration the impact of studio support required to manage an external team. So let me cover this really quickly. So in this slide, you can see that there's two rates. There's a vendor rate and a studio rate, and there's a significant difference between the two. Anything I show you today, unless I say otherwise, it's just an example. So this is just really here to outline the topic for today, but essentially, this rate is more indicative of what you might see between a North American studio versus an Asia studio, overseas Asia studio. So, but it's not indicative of any rate from a studio or a vendor. It's just approximation for the purposes of this presentation. So, but what we have here is we have two rates, the vendor rate and the studio rate, and essentially we multiply it against a scope of work. In this case, I have man days listed down. So if you have a planned estimation of work for your external development or for your project, then you can apply the rates against it, and you'll come up with a dollar value. And you compare the dollar values, and you'll come up with a cost savings percentage. Now, what we haven't included here just yet is studio support. So when I include a studio support to this number, you'll start to see the cost savings go lower. And essentially, what I'm looking at is studio support, meaning anyone who's involved with managing the external team, anything to do with travel costs if you're heading out to an external team to work with them directly, anyone who's involved with art direction or feedback or creating job sheets for an external partner. And in the case of a distributed workforce structure, anyone who's involved with managing their secondary location from their primary location. So we just add all these costs in as studio support. And when in doubt, add the kitchen sink in as well. So if you think something needs to be under there, go ahead and do it. So I want to talk about studio support numbers specifically because that can be impacted by two things. And the first one I'm going to cover is the schedule of your project. So you might think your studio support number, you might need one person to manage an external art development project or an external art outsourcing. Well, if the schedule has been compressed, then that's going to impact your studio support because you won't be able to handle volume of work from a large team size. So let me just show it to you here very quickly. So this is an example of a resource plan for a project across 9 months. And essentially what we're looking at here is a slow ramp up and a slow ramp down. So for any project that I plan, there's a ramp up for vetting out the pipeline and tools and expectations. And then we get into full production once we've vetted out all those issues, potential issues. And then we'll go into full production, and then we'll ramp down at the end. And the reason why we ramp down at the end is just to help for two reasons. One is to help your external partner transition resources to other projects, because that'll help to mitigate the risk of the mandate rate increasing for future projects. So if there's a drop of resources at the end of the project for a external partner, you'll potentially see that they need to account for more idling or more burn rate on their side. So we try to mitigate the risk by ramping down. But the second reason is for a client. Essentially, we don't want to have, me personally, for Relic, we don't want to have a volume of work coming in near the end of our project, which is potentially the end of our internal project, where we're trying to final or finish off a product for release. So we tend to want to ramp down the resources near the end, just so that we have more of our focus on our internal finaling. So those are two reasons for that. But in this example here, half the work that we've planned is spanning across about 3 months during peak production here. But if I compress the schedule even further, half the work is now spanning across about 2 months. And if I compress the schedule even further, half the work is now spanning across 6 weeks. So the more you compress your schedule, the more potential for that to impact studio support number. So that studio support number, where you initially plan for about 1 resource or 2 resources, whatever that number may be, it'll get impacted by this, because as you compress your schedule, you start to increase the number of resources that are required at peak production. So in the case of our studio, we may have 1 person to handle 10 resources, external resources, but when we compress a schedule like this, so the initial graph that you saw was about 10 to 15 people at peak. Now we're looking at 40 plus at peak with this compression. 1 person can't handle that amount of volume of work. So we need to reevaluate our studio support costs there, add 2, 3 additional people to support that, whatever the plan may be. So the other issue that can affect studio support numbers is resource productivity. So I just planned this from the very beginning. Anytime I have new people coming on a project, new external people or new internal people, doesn't matter who they are. Generally, I plan for them to be about 50% efficient in the first month that they're working on a project or on a new IP. After that, they tend to be anywhere from 80% to 100% effective. So that's also something you need to take into consideration if you have new people coming onto your project or ramping up on your project. They may not be as productive. So what that means is for art production, a person that typically takes a month to do 1 character may take 2 months to do a character, create a 3D character. So take that into consideration with your studio support. So with the cost savings analysis, we're looking at, in the graph, we went from like 71% to about 58% in the example. But generally, if I'm outsourcing from a North American studio to a lower tier or lower cost center like Asia, I'm generally looking for 35 to 50% in terms of a range of cost savings. Now, that can change depending on the type of work you're outsourcing, whether it's cinematics, or whether you're working locally, or whether you're working with contractors. It all depends. But I just wanted to point that out for these graphs in terms of my personal expectation. When I'm working with a low-cost center, I'm looking for this range. But you know, the one thing I keep hearing from different project producers is that cost savings doesn't really matter to them. Not as much as I had thought. And it's interesting, because you'll have producers who are like, that number could be 0 for all they care. Now, 0 is maybe not what you're looking for, but essentially, even 20% is fine for them, 10% is fine for them. But the question was why? And so I started to realize that there are different stakeholders within the organization that have different reasons to outsource. And once I started to understand that, Then I started to build scalability metrics that applied to their needs. And so, same thing for you guys. If you plan to look into scalability metrics, it's really a question of who you're talking about, who you're talking to, who you're discussing with in your organization about their needs. So I'm just going to cover a few scalability metrics that were built based on discussions with different people within the studio. So there's 3 that I came up with that seem to do very well, and your organizations might have different metrics that will come up, but these three are a good start. So the first one's man effort established metric. And what this really looks at is the total man effort for your project. And so let's just say it's a programming project. It'll look at the total man effort that you're budgeting for your project, and it'll look at what percentage of that is being done at an external partner or in a secondary location. And then that'll become a percentage. And so that's a really good metric for people who are interested in supporting infrastructure for your external partners. So let's just say that number is 10% for you, where 10% of your man effort is established externally or with a secondary location. Then you have to look at the 90% that's internal at your studio. How much of that 90%, how much infrastructure are you providing to support that in terms of design or in terms of management or production? And so you got to look at that for the other 10%, that do we have an appropriate portion of infrastructure in place, whether at the external team or whether we need to support that from the internal side. So that's what that is. The second metric is added value. This just looks at asks the question, what is how much added man effort are we providing to the project by outsourcing? And so added value basically looks at the total budget and divides it against the mandate rate that we have for internal, and basically looks at, compares that against the projected plan for internal and internal together, and just looks at the differences, like how much additional man effort are we adding by outsourcing. And the third metric is budget savings. And this is really interesting because it just looks at the total man effort that you've planned out using external and internal numbers, and then it'll combine that together and divide it against the internal rate to determine, well, how much more would it cost us to do all that man effort internally? So that basically it's saying, if we don't outsource, how much do we have to increase our budget to accommodate the same amount of work? So that's what that metric is. And then again, for the distributed workforce structure, it's the same thing. You have your primary location and you have your secondary location. These metrics impact the decision on how much you want to distribute your team. So if you have specific goals in mind, then you have to look at these as a decision maker. Do we need to add more effort to the project? Do we need to reduce increase our budget savings? And then the man effort established determines how much infrastructure and support we need in place for that size of a team. So the next step is essentially scalability, getting the scalability metrics and mapping it across different scales. So I have 1,000 to 10,000 on this chart here from left to right, and then I have the percentages of the metrics on the left-hand side from bottom to top. And what we're really looking at here is trying to find out what our, I guess you could say our sweet spot is, or our optimum savings metrics, or our threshold. So this doesn't represent any studio or vendor, but the percentages are very similar to what we have experienced at Relic. So right there on the 7,000 mark, I've grayed out some of the metrics there because that's the point that we consider the point of diminishing returns. So that's where we consider our optimum metric. So we're going to get back to the optimum metrics in a moment. But basically, I want to apply these metrics to a case study from Relic. And essentially, we went through a 3-step process with Relic, where we had a project that did conventional art outsourcing, which is basically taking art and some bullet points and sending it out to an external team, and then getting the work back. And then we took the second step of distributed development, which is expanding the pipeline and tools to an external team. And this actually helped improve a lot of our metrics, because we found with conventional outsourcing, we didn't get the work back in the way that we needed, because the external team didn't have context as to how the assets were being used externally, or the external team didn't have context of how the assets were being used internally. So when we updated to distributed development, we found that our cost savings, our budget savings, our added value metric, our manner for establish, all these metrics increased significantly. And the third step for the case study that I'm going to show you is we ended up dissolving the outsource manager role completely, because we started to find that as we continue to scale production, the outsource manager that we had in place couldn't handle all the volume of work. So I'll explain that a little bit later, but essentially what we did was we transitioned the responsibilities over to the different leads and their respective positions. So if we were trying to scale a character team or an environment team or level building or programming team, then they would be directly responsible for the scalable resources. And then the outsource manager would primarily be focused on high level, more of a producer role. So initially we had the outsource manager role there, but because of the scale, we dissolved it, and so that the responsibility went under the leads in the CDO. So just really quickly to show you the metrics. The first project that we did a few years back, these are some of the values that we had. We weren't actually actively looking to track these metrics, but when we applied the scalability metrics this year, it was really interesting to see, because we weren't really getting much of anything out of outsourcing, doing the conventional art outsourcing approach. Our budget savings was about 13% from what we could determine. Our manner for establish was a fair amount, but our added value metric was quite low. We didn't really generate additional man effort by outsourcing in the conventional manner. So near the end of this project, we realized that we needed to take a more distributed approach. We wanted to distribute our internal working environment to an external team. So we started to help support our external team by establishing the tools and pipeline chains so that they were able to create assets in the same way that our internal team did, and then also integrate them into the engine the same way. And that's where we came up with Project B, which was quite a success, because we increased our man effort significantly by about additional 5%. Our budget savings went up almost to 20%. Our added value metric didn't really move, but that was because it was the first time we did distributed development. We put a lot of effort into rebuilding our tool pipeline to work for an external team, because previously we hadn't anticipated deploying our tools and our custom engine externally. So, and I want to mention here too, with Project B, even though we had these gains, we did it with 35% less scope, which was quite amazing. So it just means that we were more efficient with a distributed development approach. And then Project C is basically what I did was I took the optimum or threshold metrics from a few slides back, and I've just applied them here. This is kind of where we want to go, or we're considering that this is potentially where we could go with our next engagement, working with an external team. And so we're starting to evaluate that now to see, like, what would it take to get to these numbers. And right away you can see with the man effort established to 40%, like, that's huge compared to 20% a few years back. And we've known since the Project A that we've had the challenge of managing an external team with just one resource. So this is where we decided at the end of Project 2 to dissolve the outsource manager's role. And actually, in midway through production, we distributed the responsibilities to all the leads. It just made more sense. There's more context to the work. There's no middleman. The specialization is across all disciplines. So you have art leads and art directors from different disciplines weighing in on the production of an external team and the deliverables. So this is kind of the choice we're making right now is dissolving the role and assuming we do this amount of work for the next engagement. So that should give you a bit of context of how scalability metrics can be used. And I think one thing I didn't mention was in terms of the metrics themselves, they actually apply to different disciplines within the studio. Like the budget savings metric is more centric from a producer side who's planning the development. And the added value metric, in our case, came from design. So potentially if you have a designer that's like, we want to do more, but we don't have the budget to do it, this metric is very important to them because they want to know that they can do an extra 2 levels or an extra 2 armies, et cetera. Man effort established was very important from a operations point of view. Like, do we need to increase the space in our studio to support the next project, or are we establishing a certain percentage of work externally that we don't have to do that? We don't have to move into another studio space. That also applies to people who are involved with managing an external team. The question comes up, if we do this amount of work, how much will an external team impact an internal team? And so that number was really important because when it was less than 20%, the impact was minimal, but when it was less than 15%, the impact was minimal, but anything above that, and we need to get a lot more people involved from an infrastructure level. So, oh, yeah, thanks. So I'm just going to wrap this up. So the metrics, essentially, we want to convert them over to actionable metrics, what I like to call key performance indicators. And that's just a way to track your goals because these numbers can mean something different to different people. So what we want to do is we want to be able to track this through a simple range of 0 to 100%. And so I'm running a little bit out of time here, so I'm just going to skim through this really quickly. But essentially what I've done is I've taken all the metrics that we just looked at, the man effort established, added value, budget savings, and I've rescaled them to a 0 to 100% range. And essentially, I've given them ranges of anything above 100% is outperforming, between 75 and 100 is normal performance, between 50 and 75 is underperforming, and anything less than 50% needs escalation. So very clearly, anyone in your organization looking at your metrics will know if we're on track, or we're underperforming, or we have a serious problem and we need to talk about it. So the way to do it is, this is a simplified way of doing it. I just ensured that the threshold metrics equated to 100%. So in case of the added value metric, multiplied it by 5, budget saving multiplied by 4 to get 100%. The man effort metric multiplied by 2.5 to get it to 100%. And so if you apply that to the metrics we've seen from project A, B, and C, very clearly, it's no longer about the specific metrics. The KPIs just tell you that, oh, that's in the red, that's in the yellow, that's in the green. So it's a very quick way to track your goals without having to understand what the values are actually telling you. So you can give this to a GM, you can give this to an art lead, give it to anyone in your organization, they'll understand where you are with your goals. So just to recap on our purpose today, really the presentation was about establishing reliable metrics to help you make decisions about outsourcing or distributing your workforce. So essentially for scalability. So what we went through was we talked about distributed trends, And basically what I want to point out here is that we talked about how to manage the impact of idle burn rate using lower tier cost locations, and that's what the distributed workforce structure is, to help maintain consistent mandate rates. And basically we identified reliable metrics to plan the distribution of those resources. For cost savings analysis, I just talked quickly about studio support primarily has an impact on cost savings analysis. And we also talked about schedule compression as well as productivity. And in terms of decision-making KPIs, key performance indicators, you need to know what your KPIs are telling you. So whether it's a scalability metric, a added value metric, or a budget savings metric, you just need to know what the numbers mean. So as an organization, agree on the KPI goals, what it means to have 100% or 80% or 50% KPI. And then, of course, track your KPIs through production. And that's it.
So, any questions?
You know, I know this was a little bit metric heavy for a presentation, but you know, we're trending towards working with external partners that are distributing their workforce in the same way that we're distributing our scalability as clients or as developers. It's just that there's an opportunity that exists with Asia and Europe where they can create a distributed workforce structure with lower tier locations or lower cost locations, which we didn't have with the consolidated workforce like we do in North America. So a lot of these metrics really help to make those decisions, and it really means the difference between success or just turning your tertiary or secondary locations into siloed studios working on individual projects. So if you have any questions about this in detail, feel free to email me, or I'm still here for another 15 minutes, so more than happy to talk about it.
Et en fait, s'il y a quelqu'un qui parle français, je peux faire la traduction si quelqu'un n'ose pas poser des questions.
Hi, so I'm Alexandre Ribeiro from Me Tomorrow. Thanks for your presentation. I'm wondering, seeing this, do you have any quality metrics? Actually, you focus a lot on costs, on savings, and I think that in distributed workforce and outsourcing, maintaining a good level of quality is key. So do you use it, and do you compare it with the cost KPIs?
So this presentation specifically was mostly geared towards, I would call them higher tier metrics for planning purposes. But in terms of my experience working with metrics, there's something that we call tactile metrics or tactical metrics that we use day to day to manage performance. And a lot of it has an impact on how we perceive quality. So some of the things that we track are the number of iterations that occur on an asset, on a specific asset, the amount of turnaround in terms of feedback or the delay in feedback that has an impact on schedule. Things like the number of words that are used in a communication of feedback back and forth between a client and or a primary location and external location. These are another one is revision. We look at the duration of time spent on revising an asset as opposed to just looking at how many times an asset is revised. So these things have these metrics, these tactile metrics combined together give us more of a quality metric to go with. So it's not something that I cover today, but certainly those are metrics that are we use on a day-to-day basis to manage resources.
Having been an interface between artists in-house and an external studio, There's also language is a very important factor. Fortunately, I speak English, but working for a French studio, if you try and make an interface directly between, say, an art lead and a studio, because sometimes you're getting down into minute detail, and to actually describe that, if you don't have somebody, the language is so important when you're interfacing with there's no way of bringing that into scalability, is there? The quality of the language interface.
Right. So certainly, like when I'm working in Asia, my Mandarin skills are really poor. I've learned a little bit, but in terms of interfacing, it's not up to par. When we do choose to work with a external partner, essentially we're looking for anyone that has a strong communication infrastructure. So someone or a group of people that we're able to interface with. So essentially we're looking for people that do speak English if we want to communicate with them in English. But even then, you may end up talking to a producer or a manager type, and that might not be enough if you need to talk at the artist level. So being on site or planning to be on site, especially at the beginning of production, the first 4 to 6 weeks of an engagement is very important. And then the second key time in the schedule is at peak production, to be on site as well, just to work with the artist directly. Of course, you'll probably have a translator side by side with you while you're working with the artist directly, but being in person is a lot better than trying to communicate across distances. All right, that's good. Thank you very much.